There is a stretch of fence in northeastern Utah that should be the most boring thing in the world. 4 strands of weathered wire run between old wooden posts, surrounded by sagebrush and red desert soil that darkens to the color of dried blood when the sun disappears behind the mountains. There is nothing remarkable about it. No ancient ruins, no abandoned machinery, no warning signs, just a fence marking the edge of a remote ranch in the Uinta Basin. And yet, on one particular night, that ordinary fence became the center of an event that would force investigators to question assumptions they had carried for years. It was 17 minutes past 2 o'clock in the morning. The property was empty of researchers. There was no active investigation underway. No one standing in the darkness with a camera. No technician watching a monitor from a nearby building. The ranch was supposed to be quiet. Then 4 independent sensor systems triggered at almost exactly the same moment. They did not activate one after another. There was no obvious cascade moving from one instrument to the next. They responded simultaneously, as though something had crossed an invisible boundary, and every instrument positioned around that boundary had detected the same event from a different physical perspective. That detail would matter later. The instruments had been designed to measure different things. Some monitored electromagnetic activity. Others watched the environment through infrared cameras. Additional systems listened to sounds beyond the normal range of human hearing, while sensors buried beneath the ground monitored vibrations traveling through the earth. Each system had its own weaknesses, but if several independent systems reacted to the same event at the same time, the possibility of a simple camera glitch or isolated equipment failure became much harder to explain. The following morning, the researchers retrieved the infrared footage. What they found was not immediately dramatic. There was no enormous object descending from the sky, no brilliant light crossing the desert, no creature standing in front of the camera. Instead, there was something moving along the fence. The first questions were predictable. Could it be a deer, a coyote, a fox, a person, a change in temperature, a reflection, a thermal bloom, an insect close to the lens? The team went through the obvious possibilities, but the movement did not fit comfortably into any of them. Across 47 consecutive frames, the shape maintained a remarkably consistent distance from the wire. It moved steadily along the boundary, neither approaching the fence nor drifting away from it. There was no sudden panic, no animal-like burst of speed, no obvious attempt to escape. It simply continued forward, steady, deliberate, patient. Then something happened that made the investigators stop the footage. Between one frame and the next, the shape disappeared. There was no visible transition, no motion blur, no gradual fading, no final frame showing it leaving the camera's field of view. It was there, and then it wasn't. The researchers replayed the sequence repeatedly, looking for the ordinary explanation they assumed had to exist somewhere inside the footage. Eventually, one person in the review room described the disappearance in a way that would stay with the team long afterward. "It vanished," he said, as if whatever it was had understood that it had been seen. That is not a scientific conclusion. There is no instrument capable of measuring whether an unknown object understands that it is being observed. But the statement reveals why the incident was so unsettling. Because this was not just about a strange shape appearing on a camera. It was about the place where the shape appeared. The fence was not simply a fence. It marked the boundary of a property that had spent decades accumulating stories of unexplained lights, unusual animal deaths, strange sounds, equipment failures, and other reported anomalies. The property has a name: Skinwalker Ranch. Located in Utah's Uinta Basin, The ranch sits within a vast landscape of high desert, mountains, dry valleys, and enormous stretches of open sky. During the day, the terrain can look almost brutally ordinary. Sagebrush covers the ground, dirt roads cut through the property, fences divide grazing areas, buildings sit against the landscape like they could belong to almost any working ranch in the American West. But at night, the environment changes completely. The air becomes colder. The desert becomes almost silent. The mountains turn into dark silhouettes, and the absence of city lights allows thousands of stars to dominate the sky. That darkness creates a perfect environment for mystery. It also creates a perfect environment for mistakes. Distant lights can be difficult to identify. Animals can move through darkness without being noticed. Atmospheric conditions can distort sounds and visual objects. Temperature differences can create unusual infrared readings. Electronic equipment can behave differently under changing environmental conditions. That is precisely why investigators who approach Skinwalker Ranch from a scientific perspective face such a difficult task. Every strange event has to survive the ordinary explanations before it becomes genuinely interesting. And, according to the people who have spent years studying the property, that is where Skinwalker becomes different. Most allegedly, haunted locations are passive. You arrive, you investigate, you wait. And most of the time, nothing happens. You spend hours in the cold with cameras running and microphones recording, listening to every branch move in the wind. Eventually, after several nights, you pack your equipment and go home with a few unexplained sounds, a blurry image, or perhaps nothing at all. Skinwalker has developed a very different reputation. Researchers who have worked there have repeatedly described the property as active. Not necessarily active in the supernatural sense, but active in the sense that unusual observations seem to occur often enough to keep investigators coming back. The strange thing is not simply that something happens. It is the apparent timing. Bring nothing and the night may remain quiet. Bring cameras, sensors, monitoring equipment, and a team prepared to investigate. And suddenly, the sky may provide something worth recording. That pattern has led to one of the most controversial ideas surrounding the ranch: the possibility that whatever produces the anomalies may somehow be connected to observation. Again, that is a hypothesis, not a proven fact. There is no accepted scientific evidence demonstrating that Skinwalker Ranch itself is conscious, or that an unknown intelligence deliberately responds to researchers. But when multiple investigators independently describe the same subjective experience, the question becomes difficult to ignore. They describe the feeling that the ranch is somehow responding to attention, not like a storm, not like a geological process, something that, at least from the perspective of the people experiencing it, feels almost intentional. It is the same instinctive sensation a person can experience when walking through an empty house at night and suddenly turns around because, without any logical reason, they feel someone is standing behind them. You cannot put that feeling into a data table. You cannot calibrate a sensor to detect it. But after spending enough nights alone in a remote desert, surrounded by instruments and darkness, even experienced investigators can begin to understand why the distinction between scientific observation and human perception becomes psychologically difficult. To understand why Skinwalker acquired this reputation in the first place, however, you have to go back several decades. The modern story of the ranch began taking shape in the early 1990s when a family arrived there hoping to live a normal life. They were not paranormal investigators. They were not looking for monsters. They were not searching for UFOs. They were ranchers. They wanted land, cattle, water, pasture, and the quiet life that comes from living far away from crowded cities. Instead, according to accounts associated with the family, strange events began almost immediately. Not after years, not after decades, within weeks. What followed was a sequence of experiences that would eventually transform the ranch from a private piece of agricultural property into one of the most controversial locations in the world of unexplained phenomena. The earliest stories centered heavily on the family's cattle. Animals were reportedly found dead, in circumstances the family considered deeply abnormal. Some carcasses were described as having unusually precise wounds or missing tissue. The descriptions became increasingly disturbing because witnesses claimed there were few of the signs normally associated with a conventional predator attack. No obvious tracks, no clear trail, no large amount of blood surrounding the animal, no straightforward explanation for how the injuries had occurred. For ranchers familiar with livestock, those details were particularly disturbing. A predator normally leaves evidence. Coyotes tear. Mountain lions crush and puncture. Scavengers consume and damage tissue after death. Even when an animal dies from natural causes, decomposition and other animals eventually leave recognizable patterns. But the accounts coming from Skinwalker described something different. Wounds that appeared strangely clean, almost surgical. That does not automatically mean an unknown creature was responsible. There are natural processes, scavengers, human interference, disease, and other possibilities that must always be considered when investigating animal deaths. But for the family living there, the events were not isolated curiosities. They were happening on their own property. They were looking at animals they had raised, and they were finding evidence they could not easily explain. The psychological effect of that kind of experience is difficult to overstate. Imagine walking out onto your land in the morning, expecting to check the cattle, and instead discovering one of your animals dead in the field. You begin by assuming there must be a normal explanation. You inspect the ground, you examine the carcass, you look for tracks, you look for signs of a predator. You ask people with experience. And then, if the expected evidence is missing, you begin searching for another explanation. Then it happens again and again. Eventually, the question stops being, what killed this animal? It becomes, what is happening here? And the cattle were only the beginning. As the family's experiences continued, reports expanded beyond livestock. Objects were said to disappear from buildings and later appear in locations where they seemingly should not have been. Strange lights were reportedly observed in the sky above the property. Some witnesses described objects moving in ways that appeared inconsistent with conventional aircraft. The more attention the family paid to the ranch, the more stories emerged, and that created the central mystery that would eventually attract investigators, government interest, wealthy researchers, and sophisticated monitoring equipment. Was Skinwalker Ranch simply a place where unusual events were being misinterpreted? Or was something genuinely unusual happening there? For years, nobody had a satisfactory answer. And the more people tried to find one, the stranger the story became. The strange events did not end with the cattle. Objects reportedly disappeared from structures that had been locked from the inside, only to turn up later in places where the family could not explain how they had arrived. Other objects seemed to appear without any clear explanation of where they had come from. And then there were the lights. Above the mesa, witnesses described lights moving through the night sky in ways that seemed difficult to reconcile with ordinary aircraft. They appeared to change direction abruptly, stop in place, accelerate, split apart, and sometimes appear to come together again. Some observations could undoubtedly have had conventional explanations. Satellites, aircraft, atmospheric effects, planets, and other distant sources can all look strange when viewed across a dark desert sky. But the family kept watching. Night after night, they returned their attention to the same sky. And the more they watched, the more convinced they became that something unusual was happening around them. That was the detail that eventually transformed a family's private nightmare into a subject of professional investigation. Because the people who came next were not ranchers, they were investigators. They arrived with instruments, technical knowledge, and something that the ranch needed desperately: skepticism. They were not interested in proving a ghost story. They were interested in finding out whether the stories could survive measurement. That distinction mattered. A strange light witnessed by one person could be misidentified. A damaged animal could have a natural cause. A missing object could have been misplaced. A malfunctioning device could simply be defective. But if the same kinds of anomalies continued appearing under controlled observation, across different investigations and separated by years, then the question became more difficult. Could the phenomenon survive scrutiny? Most legends do not. Bring a scientific team to a supposedly haunted location, surround the area with cameras and sensors, and the mystery often becomes smaller. The strange sounds become animals. The mysterious lights become aircraft. The apparitions become reflections. The impossible movements become perspective errors. The closer you look, the less mysterious the story becomes. Skinwalker, according to the investigators who studied it, seemed to do the opposite. The harder they looked, the more complicated the picture became. One of the earliest major attempts to approach the property systematically came through a privately funded research effort in the 1990s and 2000s. The investigators were not simply wandering around with handheld cameras. They approached the ranch as a research problem, attempting to document unusual events and establish whether any measurable patterns existed. And this is where one of the most controversial ideas associated with the ranch began to emerge. The phenomenon appeared to respond to observation. That does not mean researchers scientifically proved that the ranch was conscious. It does not mean there is established evidence that an unknown entity can recognize a camera or understand that it is being studied. But investigators reported something that troubled them. The activity sometimes appeared to change when the level of observation changed. It was as though the phenomenon was not simply occurring independently of the researchers. It seemed, at least from their perspective, to be interacting with the investigation itself. Think about how strange that would be if it were true. A rock does not care whether you look at it. A mountain does not become more active because a scientist brings better equipment. A deer may react when it realizes a person is nearby, but it does not normally adjust its behavior according to whether that person is holding a cheap camera or an advanced scientific instrument. Yet the reports coming from Skinwalker described something that seemed different. Bring basic equipment, and the results were often ambiguous. Bring more sophisticated equipment, and the investigators reported increasingly complex anomalies. It created the unsettling impression that the phenomenon was somehow operating at the edge of whatever the investigators could detect. Almost as though there were always another layer beyond the measurement. For years, this idea remained little more than a disturbing hypothesis. Then the property changed hands. In 2016, businessman Brandon Fugal became the owner of Skinwalker Ranch, and the investigation entered a new era. Fugal was not known primarily as a paranormal investigator. His background was in commercial real estate, and his approach to the ranch was fundamentally different from the image of someone chasing ghosts through the desert at night. He approached the mystery as a problem that required better equipment, better data, more sensors, more redundancy, and, above all, fewer opportunities for an anomaly to escape detection. For decades, investigators had been forced to work with limited technology. Cameras could only watch certain areas, sensors could only measure certain frequencies. Researchers could only be in one location at a time. That created a weakness. Imagine trying to understand a moving target with a flashlight. You point the beam toward one section of darkness. The target disappears. You move the beam somewhere else. Something happens behind you. The problem is not necessarily that the target is supernatural. The problem may simply be that your field of observation is too small. Fugal's approach was essentially to eliminate that weakness. If the ranch was going to produce unexplained events, the team would surround those events with enough instruments that there would be nowhere for them to hide. Cameras multiplied across the property. Sensors were installed in different locations. Researchers began collecting electromagnetic measurements, thermal imagery, acoustic data, seismic information, and other environmental readings. The ranch was becoming a laboratory. And as the seasons passed, the volume of information grew. Events that might once have been described only in someone's personal testimony could now potentially be compared against timestamps, environmental conditions, camera footage, and multiple independent sensors. The gap between something happening and something being recorded became smaller, but it did not disappear. And eventually, that became the most important realization of all. Because the researchers had been concentrating on the center of the mystery, the mesa, the interior structures, the areas where unusual electromagnetic activity had reportedly occurred, the locations associated with strange lights and other anomalies. In other words, they were looking inward. That seemed completely logical. If something strange was happening on the ranch, why would you not investigate the place where the strange events had already been reported? But after years of monitoring, another possibility began to emerge. What if the center was not the whole story? What if the most important part of the ranch was not what happened inside the property, but what happened at its boundaries? That question was hidden inside the team's own data. According to the investigation narrative, Fugal's team began noticing patterns in equipment failures and other anomalies. The failures did not always appear randomly distributed across the property. They seemed to cluster. Cameras malfunctioned, batteries drained unexpectedly. Recording systems stopped, hard drives became corrupted. Instruments that had passed diagnostic tests could behave differently once they were moved into particular areas. Again, none of these things automatically proves anything extraordinary. Electronic equipment can fail. Batteries can drain because of temperature. Storage devices can become corrupted. Electromagnetic interference can affect sensitive instruments. Environmental conditions can damage electronics. Those explanations had to be considered. But the investigators noticed something that made the failures more interesting. Location appeared to matter. Equipment that behaved normally in one place could become unreliable in another. Move it away from the suspected active zone, and the equipment might return to normal. Bring it back, and the problem could reappear. That was the kind of pattern researchers could not simply dismiss without investigating. Because if equipment failure had a geographical component, then the question was no longer merely, why did this camera stop working? It became, what is different about the environment in this particular location? And that question opened an entirely new direction. The team began comparing equipment failures against the timing of other anomalies. They examined reports of strange lights. They looked at electromagnetic readings. They reviewed environmental conditions. They considered physical effects reported by members of the research team: headaches, nausea, pressure sensations, unusual discomfort. None of these symptoms, by themselves, proved anything about the ranch. Human beings experience them for countless ordinary reasons, especially when working long nights in harsh environments. But the investigators were looking for correlations. Did the effects become more common during active experiments? Did they cluster around particular locations? Did equipment problems occur at the same time as unusual environmental readings? And most importantly, did anything happen when nobody was deliberately looking? That last question was the one that had been missing. For years, every investigation had followed the phenomenon. If something appeared over the mesa, cameras pointed toward the mesa. If something happened near a particular structure, researchers moved toward that structure. If unusual readings appeared in a suspected hot zone, more instruments were deployed there. The investigators were constantly moving toward the action. But what if the action was moving around them? What if their attention itself created a blind spot? The realization was uncomfortable, because every camera pointed inward created darkness somewhere else. Every sensor placed in the center left the perimeter less monitored. Every researcher standing inside the property was, by definition, not standing outside it. And that meant there was one enormous region the investigation had largely neglected: the edge, the fence line, the boundary between the ranch and everything beyond it. For nearly 3 decades, the central question had been, what is happening inside Skinwalker Ranch? Now, the team had to consider a completely different question. What is happening at the edge of Skinwalker Ranch when nobody is watching? That was a much more dangerous question, because if the phenomenon was somehow responsive to human attention, then the researchers may have spent decades teaching it exactly where they were looking. They had built a spotlight. They had aimed it at the center, and perhaps, without realizing it, they had left the darkness around the edges completely untouched. The next step would be to change that. Instead of chasing the phenomenon, the team would attempt something radically different. They would build a net around the ranch. And for the first time in the modern history of Skinwalker Ranch, the investigation would not simply watch the places where something had already happened. It would watch everywhere. The equipment failures continued to add another layer to the mystery. When researchers moved the same instruments roughly 200 yards away from an active zone, they often behaved normally. Batteries lasted. Recording systems stayed online. Sensors passed their diagnostics. But when the equipment was brought back into the suspected hot zone, the problems could return. From a scientific standpoint, that alone was not enough to prove anything extraordinary. There were plenty of ordinary possibilities: magnetic interference, electrical ground currents, temperature changes, moisture in the soil, or some other environmental factor that the team had not yet identified. Any responsible investigation had to consider those explanations first. But the equipment failures were only one thread in a much larger pattern. When the researchers began comparing different categories of observations, other pieces appeared to line up with the same timeline. The aerial phenomena, the strange lights, and the objects reported moving through the sky seemed to occur disproportionately during active investigation sessions. They were not simply appearing on random nights when the ranch was empty and everyone was asleep. According to the team's observations, many of the most interesting events occurred when researchers were outside, instruments raised, cameras running, and attention focused directly on the environment around them.